But kind of the main thing I'm going to cover today is going to be the timing of it, the different ways you can start seeds. So being indoors, outside in a greenhouse or a cold frame, and then sort of the latest and maybe most efficient way to do it would be direct sowing, directly sowing into your garden when the soil temperature is appropriate. That I find that really only works well for certain things. There are some things that just, if you can start them indoors, like especially like tomatoes and peppers, they really take off with that in that warm environment. And then if your timing is good and you can get them outside at the right time, they're just growing vigorously from seed all the way until fruit. So it's a pretty cool way to do it. I think I will start basically with saying that there's such a wide variety of things you can grow from seed. We sell hundreds of different edible food crops that you can grow from seed here. We also sell all types of ornamentals that you can grow from seed here. And all of the seeds, a lot of them, the requirements can be a little different. You need to read the back of the seed packet. That's the one thing. People ask me, how deep do I plant it? What's the spacing? Every seed packet tells you that on the back. They absolutely do. And I'm not going to go over each one because a lot of what is being taken into consideration is the actual size of the seed. If it's a tiny, tiny seed, like say carrot seeds are super, super tiny, you don't plant them very deep because then they would have a lot of soil to overcome when they're sprouting. And they just don't need to be very deep. So that's information that's on the back of every single seed packet. And then a little further down the line, if you get into the stuff where, oh, this guy has this cool cactus and he sent me this seed, then you get into things like sort of like rule of thumb, where it's like, unless it's otherwise listed, you only want it to be maybe twice the depth of the width of that seed. So for some seeds, you can do it that way, for things like, for things that you might be direct sowing, like corn is one that if I'm going to do corn, I just like to direct sow it. I don't want to mess with putting it in a cell tray and then rowing it out and all that. If the soil temperature is proper, you can plant it and in 3 days it'll sprout up. So there are some things that I'll recommend you just direct sow when the time is correct. But yeah, so seed size has a lot to do with the planting depth of it, but every seed packet, they just should have that information on them because it's what you're going to need to know off the bat. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the packets and the sowing and the differences in seed. Timing is another big thing, and for that I will show you this. This is a soil thermometer. So they sell some, have a really, really long spike on them. Those can also be used for compost piles because they get deeper. For something like this to measure soil temperature, it only needs to go 2 inches into the soil, about like that. Any deeper than that and you're below the depth, the seed's going to be germinating and rooting anyways. So there's really no sense in that. These ones are great, and I've noticed on almost all seed thermometers, it'll be hard for you to see here, but there's writing on here. And those, they actually list, they're saying minimum temperature to transplant out. And so that gives you a great idea, and it lists things like cabbage, celery, onion, peas. Those would be the first thing you would direct sow. Those you can sow when the soil temperature is like 45 to 50 degrees. At this time of year, we're probably not even there yet, really. We get more days like this, and it will start getting there. And one year, every other day, I just measured the soil for like 3 months. And even at this time of year, it does start to go like this. The averages start to climb up. But it is February. We will still have some extremely cold nights. So especially really, really tiny seed that are, broccoli might be a good example. I think it would be too early to probably direct sow broccoli unless you're doing special things like sort of mounding your rows and maybe even using some type of heat-absorbing plastic. But soil temperature is very, very important. I mean, it can be the difference, especially for things like tomatoes and peppers that grow really fast. They can only grow fast if the soil temperature is proper for them. If you'd like to grab a chair, you can. Okay. And then, on this thing, it also gets into some of the last things you would direct. So would be like, cantaloupe, watermelons, pumpkins, hot peppers, spicy peppers, and then the very last thing they list is okra, because it likes really, they're saying it likes 70-degree soil, which it'll germinate in a lot less than that, but it does like it hot, so just know that. But these are really handy to have, and they're also pretty cheap. I think they're like $10 to $20 is all, and it's, you know, yeah, usually they come in a little box and they have some instructions on them, but these are great to have if you're getting serious about seed starting or even just curious about your garden. It's just kind of fun. So that about covers that, and now I'm going to get into the methods. Yeah?
You sell those temperature gauges here?
We do. We have temperature gauges here. So basically, everything that I'm going to show you, I just pulled it off the racks in our garden store, including all the seed and stuff. So after I'm done talking to you guys, and I think I don't mind answering some questions as we go, but if you have like big questions, I'll be sure to allow a little time at the end, and I'll answer as many as I can. But yeah, almost everything I'm going to show you, like it even still has its price tag on it. So all this stuff you can get in there if you need it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is starting seeds indoors, which you can even, I mean, I've started things as early as right after Christmas. You know, indoors, when I'm sowing things indoors, I'm always using a humidity dome, which is what this guy over here is. This is a really standard size. They might make them bigger, but this is kind of the size everybody uses, and it's really handy because your smaller heat mats fit perfectly under one of these. This, you know, it covers this whole thing with no wasted space. So this is kind of the way to go, and if you do just want to try starting a few things indoors, get yourself, so there's actually a few pieces to it, but you have your tray. This is basically your water catch. This is just to catch excess water and keep it off of your, you know, things, your furniture. What would go inside this would be what's called a cell tray. This is like a small skinny one. This is what a lot of our annual plugs come in here at the nursery, and then we pot them up. But these, you can see, that fits nicely in there. You could fit two more side by side. Or I think this is what we sell inside, just the full. And these ones, you know, they come in 50, 75, like 108 or something. You can get ones with really tiny cells. But basically, this is another thing where if you just kind of want a basic rule of thumb, the tinier the seed, probably the smaller cell that you can put it in. You know, things like, I mean, you know, like some watermelon or cucumber seeds can be pretty big, and then you get into things like squashes, and they're even bigger, pumpkin seeds. You'd want to go for something a minimum of this size, because once they do send out a root, it can fill one of these pretty quick. So just kind of think about that. The size of the seed itself is going to reflect the size of cell you want to put it into. You can also use things, you know, I'm sure everybody's seen these Jiffy pots. These are made out of just like, you know, recycled wood fibers. They're meant to break down. They're completely organic. Now what I found about these is I wouldn't recommend these for your starting your very most earliest things indoors, or like one thing you might start super early indoors would be those super hot peppers, like the Carolina Reaper and things. Those take forever to germinate, and they need a really warm root zone. So that would be a great thing to start indoors early. Maybe even, you know, you could start them now. I think January for a lot of stuff is too early, because you're going to run into a point where it's big enough to transplant out, but it's not appropriate to transplant it out yet. So kind of be aware of that. But anyways, what I was going to say, what I found with these is that for the earliest stuff, these will start to mold inside a humidity dome before they're ready. So for the earliest stuff, I would go for something plastic like this, and make sure it's sterile too. You can see I just grabbed these from by the dumpster. They're not clean, and when you're starting seeds, it's pretty important that the stuff is clean, because any type of, you know, you're giving things like molds and, you know, algae and things like that the perfect environment, as well as you're giving the seeds the perfect environment. So just cleanliness is good. It's not like, you know, I mean, and I haven't done any of this, but I've heard and I've looked a little into like growing mushrooms and, like, you know, inoculating your jars and things like that. And that's like even beyond it. You have to like sterilize things that way. you don't really have to worry about that, or like, you know, wearing gloves or masking up for this, but you know, just I use used trays a lot, and just be sure you're cleaning them or dipping them in like a diluted bleach solution to kill any like pathogens. But yeah, so for the very earliest stuff you're starting indoors, I don't recommend these. So going on to just more indoor seed starting stuff, you know, that, to me, that was like the funnest way to do it, because in, you know, January and February, when not much else is going on, you can still have a nice indoor gardening project. You're not out in the cold. So I found it to be really enjoyable. Basically, for any indoor seed starting, you're going to want a heat mat too. So if you get yourself one of these, get yourself a heat mat. These ones, most of them do not come with their own thermostat. They don't come with a temperature controller. They're kind of set for just a good warm temperature. I find usually right above them it'll get up to 80 or even 85 degrees. When it's below one of these, it won't get that hot inside of it, because it's not, you know, there's room for air in between these. But that's another thing. For these, I've never worried about a thermostat. It's just, if I feel like it's getting too warm in there, or I'm seeing it completely cover the inside with condensation like every couple of hours, what I'll do is I'll take and I'll fold a towel and put that on the heat mat and then set my thing on it. So all you're doing is just moving the heat further away from what you don't want to be so hot. So I find that's an effective way. If you don't have a thermostat to dial up a certain number, just put more space between your heat mat and the bottom of your seed starting compartment. So yeah, for indoors, you're gonna want heat under them. That's the other thing. Things that will germinate without heat, typically if you can warm the rooting area up a little bit, they'll germinate faster. From what I've found, like everything likes a little heat when the seed is starting. Things like brassicas, you know, so like kale, kohlrabi, things like that, they seem to be just about the least picky as far as that. I mean, you get into things like broccoli, and then they can really like it, those things that do like the more warm and the sun. But yeah, just kind of be aware of that. And then, so even on, you know, like these are Ed Hume seeds, which are everywhere. You know, you can get these at most supermarkets and stuff. And so even these will tell you, they have a little spot about sowing, thinning, and transplanting. They often tell you how long they'll take to germinate. But yeah, these ones, from what I'm seeing here, it doesn't say anything about soil temperature. It just says it'll take this long depending on soil warmth. So that's your key. You know, if it's on a heat mat, it'll do it a little quicker. But I find, yeah, I would use a heat mat for almost anything. And today's class isn't about cuttings. When I do cuttings, I put almost all those on a heat mat too, in there, whenever I stick them in. Just a little bit of warmth is going to help stimulate that root growth. So, okay, I guess the couple things I haven't covered yet as far as the indoor seed starting. We've covered, you know, the conditions in here, your little trays, kind of what you're sowing. The other two things you're gonna need, of course, are water and light. You got heat under the, you know, coming up from the bottom, nice gentle heat, that'll help them. But when it comes to water and light, I think one thing people do a lot, especially when they're starting seeds indoors in a closed system like this, is they get them too wet, they water them, and you can even overdo it from the beginning. Like if you say sow your seeds, you know, get your seed tray full, and by the way, there's nothing saying you can't do several different varieties in one tray. I've done tomatoes right next to peppers, right next to cucumbers, right next to all in one tray, all in one humidity dome, and it works okay, but they do grow at different rates. But there's nothing saying you can't do that. It doesn't have to be all one thing in one dome. It can be a mixture. But if you take one of these, you know, put your soil in there, get your seeds to the correct depth, water them in. I mean, if you water it in and it's still just pouring water and you set it in this and close it up, it's going to be like soup in there. It's going to be sitting in its own muck, and they'll probably just rot out. So that's another thing. Kind of what I tell people is like, think about a wrung out sponge. It's still wet, it's still damp, but it's not nearly as heavy as it could be. You know, like you can run a sponge under the water and it gets super heavy. You don't want your soil to be that heavy. You want it to be lighter than that. And I guess, again, this leaves a lot up to interpretation, because if you wring the heck out of a sponge, there's barely any water left in there. but your tray should not be dripping when you set it in. You should let it drip elsewhere, and there really shouldn't be standing water in the bottom of your tray. It is there to catch it, but if there's standing water below there, that's just too much. So at that point, what I would do is I'd remove my cell tray and I'd just dump it out and I'd put it back in. And then the thing is, while it's on a mat, and whether it's in your window or whether you're using like a grow light for things that need more intense light, it's just gonna, the condensation is gonna come up from the bottom, it's gonna hit the inside of the top of this, and it's gonna drip right back down. So it doesn't lose water very quickly. And then once the seeds, and this will be true for any of the methods I'm listing, but once the seeds poke up from the soil, they immediately need less humidity than they did when they were actually germinating. So at that point, these all come with vents. At that point, you can start opening your vents and things like that. Because the other thing, I'll cover this towards the end of the talk, but we'll go into like hardening off and how to get your things that you start indoors, outdoors, because that's also not, you can't take something you've had indoors in a 70-degree house and just put it right out in full sun and expect it to do well. That'll shock it and probably burn it. So okay, let me see here. Oh, and then the other way, when we're talking about starting things indoors, some people too, even if you want to, yeah. So yeah, misting is a great way because it will feed that cycle again of where it's constantly condensating and dripping back down. So usually a mist bottle would be the only way you would need to water it in something like this. And then once they come out of their humidity dome, watering becomes a little bit different. You need to watch it closer. But yeah, as long as they're in a humidity dome, I think you can pretty much always just use a sprayer. Yeah, because they're not really going to be drying out fully. But anyways, that being said, with these, the cell tray, that's kind of the way how I like to do it if I'm transplanting any outside. If you're thinking about doing things hydroponically or in like a soilless system, you would need to start with something like this. These are, well, the brand is Grodan, but these are called rock wool cubes. And I think there's a home insulation product that is this exact same stuff. It's basically rock heated up and spun into a fiber and then compacted. So these are real light and real spongy, and basically they just hold the perfect ratio of water to air when they're soaked. So seeds start real well in these. You just poke a seed down in there and keep it wet, and it'll grow, and eventually you'll see roots come out the bottom. Also, each one of these blocks is individually wrapped to prevent like algae and mold growth on the sides. So these are pretty cool. I used to mess with these a lot because I liked doing greens indoors hydroponically in the winter. So things like things where you can just constantly kind of harvest the outer leaves on, like lettuces and things like that. Those, in a small hydroponic system, they grow so fast indoors, like it would shock you. You can have a salad every other day, just from what you pick. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do, but yeah, this could be for soilless systems. I don't think that's what most people are doing. I think, and for me lately, it's like a really time-consuming way to grow stuff, so I don't really do it this way anymore. This is also a product, I don't think we sell it, but if you are thinking about hydroponics or aeroponics or anything like that, where you don't use soil, it also means you have to start not with soil. So these keep your system clean. You don't ever want soil in a hydroponic reservoir, it clogs things up. But yeah, rock wool cubes, these are really fun. They're also great for cuttings. They're ideal for a cutting because you can take a cutting of something like a rose or whatever and stick it right in there and just keep it wet, and then eventually you'll see the roots come out the bottom. But okay, that's kind of a lot about the indoor seed starting. I think the next way, and as it gets a little bit later into the season, as we get closer to being able to plant things directly into the garden, another way you might do it is in a greenhouse or with a cold frame. So, and I'm specifically talking about like unheated greenhouses, and then a cold frame is also unheated. That's basically just like kind of like a small greenhouse for things that are already in the ground. It's a frame that you can set over things, and they usually have like a hinged piece. But when you're doing it with that, in those situations when you're starting things outside, and it's a little closer, maybe you have more room outside and you're also close to being able to direct sow them, I would still use a heat mat in that situation. It also adds just a little bit of heat to whatever else is in your greenhouse, which it isn't going to mind. So still use a heat mat when you're growing in a greenhouse or a cold frame to start those same seeds. Pretty much everything else. The greenhouse that I used before to start seeds, it was like one of those small ones with the roll up front. I think I got it at Weimar years ago. It's a pretty cheapo one. It's not a very nice greenhouse, but I don't have a lot of room. But something like that works great, and I feel like those work better for seed starting than anything else because they already have these kind of weak wire shelving units, but they will hold seed trays. So I've done those before where there's a seed tray on every one and heat on the bottom, and it kind of evens out as it goes up through the layers. The ones in the middle don't ever get very good light that way, but if you time it right and you can take them out and put them in a sunnier location when they've sprouted, that works pretty good. But yeah, I mean, mostly, the benefits for doing them that way is there's going to be less hardening off to do. They're already used to the outdoor environment rather than taking them from a warm house to the outdoors. You also have a little less control over it if it's in a greenhouse. It's, you got to go out to check on it. Watering might be a little different because especially outside in a greenhouse, like if we have a really sunny day like this and you leave your greenhouse closed up, it can get really warm in there. So there's just a little bit more, they're just kind of different methods. But I would say for the greenhouse and cold frame method, if we're getting to that transitional point where we're starting to get nighttime temperatures like consistently above 45 and then eventually above 50, then at that point you could do a lot of this same stuff that you'd be doing indoors. You could do it outdoors in a greenhouse or a cold frame, just as long as it has that heat mat under it. But a lot of them, that's another thing these seed packets say. A lot of them will list kind of like a minimum soil temperature where, if you plant it out and it's a little below that, it'll still be okay. But if it's a lot below that, it just won't grow. Because it's like, what are you doing? It's the end of the season, not the beginning. You're confusing it. But yeah, so a lot of those will have a minimum soil temperature, and that will kind of help influence, which way you're going to sow it. But I mean, I'll tell you, like, what I have the most experience in is starting them indoors, and then I've done a little bit of greenhouse and cold frame, and quite a bit of direct sowing too. But for me, it's kind of the most fun, and it's the easiest to keep an eye on when it's like, they usually end up in my kitchen, so, but it means you get to see it a lot, you get to check in on them, and it's good. So that would be the greenhouse kind of cold frame method. And then the method that you would use latest in the year, and especially with things like corn and like bush or pole beans, things like that. So they like pretty warm soil temperature. I mean, on here, it's saying for all that stuff that's not okra, but from tomatoes, corn, cantaloupe, cucumber, hot peppers, pumpkin, squash, watermelon, those all like a soil temperature of 60 or more. You're not, this is a little bit of a tangent, but so when you do take your soil's temperature, it's important you're not doing it in like a shady corner of the garden or something. It's good to do it like once the sun is out, but maybe not beating down on things. So definitely once the sun has been hitting the soil for a while, but just kind of be aware of that, because this will read the air temperature too if you just leave it, out for long enough. This is the part that's really doing most of the reading. So as long as that's about 2 inches in, and it's not in like a shady corner, you should be getting an accurate reading. And if you do it a few days in a row, that's even better, because you can kind of see if there's any weird outlying days or like, but that's what I found amazing when I was keeping track of my garden soil temperature, is that one really cold day doesn't actually change the soil temperature that much if overall the trend is going up. It might only be like 2 degrees less than it was the day before. So it's kind of cool, but it really is. It's a big heat sink. The air temperature, the changes are much more extreme than the soil temperature. It's a gradual thing. But okay, back to direct sowing outdoors. So that would be the method you would use when the soil is warm enough. You're skipping the trays, you're skipping the humidity domes, you're skipping all that stuff, and you're just basically sowing it in your garden where you want it to be, where you want it to grow. With a lot of things, so I've direct sown carrots before. That's something you can do basically, you could even do right now. They might not germinate right away, but Carrots, they don't seem to be super soil temperature dependent. A lot of them say direct sow in garden as soon as soil is workable, which is right now. So anytime they say that, it's like, well, go for it. And these ones, one thing with carrots, a lot of you probably already know, but if you have like really rocky or hard or clumpy soil, you're gonna get weird stubby carrots or carrots that fork and stuff. Carrots, like, it would be one situation where I might actually till my carrot bed just to get a finer soil texture. So I get carrots that look like carrots. But carrots are fun, they're super easy to grow. Another thing is, since the seeds are so tiny, it's really easy to sow them way too heavy. When I scatter them, I always sow them way too heavy, and then I'm kind of lazy and I don't go back in and really thin them out. It just means you get little tiny carrots. So they still taste good, but that is one thing, for tiny seeds, it's easy to sow them real heavy. And then usually if you want bigger, healthier plants, you'll go back in and you'll thin some of those out. And a lot of people even just take scissors and just go in and snip, 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 do a little gap, snip, snip, snip. And that will effectively get rid of the ones that you don't want, even though they're at that point they're done, they're gonna die. You just clipped off their only solar panels. Yeah, so you can do that with things like that. I've done that before. You don't actually have to go in and pull them out unless you want to. But yeah, thinning for things that are easy to sow heavy is good. That's a good thing to do. Really, things like here's the little packet I put together of, these are things that I would direct sow. So like corn, again, when that soil temperature is right, and you can even see it in the farmers' fields. I mean, they're all direct sowing their corn. They're not doing plugs. It would be crazy if they did that. But yeah, once the soil temperature is right on these, which they're saying, yeah, so a minimum of 65 and then up to 85. I don't know if the soil ever gets 85 around here. But that's something you would absolutely direct sow. And also corn, it's wind pollinated, so it has to be planted in a substantial amount. It's why you don't get a good ear of corn if you just plant one stalk. It won't really pollinate. So you need enough corn that they can share pollen when the wind blows. So that's specific to corn. But corn is one you would direct sow. Bush beans or pole beans, direct sow. Again, and when the soil temperature is right, they pop up in like 2 or 3 days. It's really fast. The cucumbers are great. The soil temperature doesn't have to be quite as hot for those, but they come up quick again. Watermelons like it real warm. Those ones, yeah, you'll want to plant them when you're doing like, your corn and your beans, unless you're doing them indoors, of course. A lot of squash and zucchini and things like that, they like pretty warm soil temperature too. So these are all things I would say, you could start them earlier indoors if you wanted, but just when the soil temperature is right, they're so fast, I feel like it's almost not worth it for these ones here. And then to a lesser extent, these are kind of, for me, I always want a couple tomato plants and a couple pepper plants every year. But these are things you could direct sow also, but it's just, you can start with a bigger plant if you start indoors or in a greenhouse or a cold frame. Your harvest probably wouldn't be quite as big if you waited till it was warm enough to direct sow these. They would still get there, they would still flower, and they would still produce, but you can definitely get a nicer, bigger plant if you start them a little earlier. And then same thing with with any of the hot peppers. They're very, very similar to growing a tomato as far as their germination time, soil temperature, and all that stuff. And here's some other stuff. Basil is another fun one that you could even grow exclusively indoors if you wanted. You could germinate that at any time indoors and just keep it in a sunny window and harvest the leaves. Here's just lettuce. Lettuce the soil doesn't need to be super warm for lettuce, and it's another one you could do indoors. You could direct sow it outdoors when you do carrots. There are a lot of options for it. But lettuce is a great one, and it's a pretty fast crop because even while it's growing, if you're just harvesting the outer leaves, it'll keep growing and you can still eat those. So it's kind of great because you can almost get like a perpetual harvest if you stagger the times at which you sow them. So that's that stuff. Let's see, what am I missing here?
What about lighting?
Yes, excellent point. So For most seeds, and it seems like for most, especially vegetable seeds and crops like that, you're sowing them below the soil and they don't actually need light to germinate. Most of the seeds I'm talking about today don't need light to germinate. They need it as soon as they poke their head up through the soil, because at that point they're going to start photosynthesizing, their leaves come out. But there are some seeds that need light to germinate, and those will be the ones that on the packet it says don't cover or lightly cover, where you just, and some of them, if they're such tiny seeds, so this is how I do all my cacti seed. A lot of cacti seed are like smaller than a poppy seed. They're really, really tiny. And so for these, I filled this with cactus mix, something that drains well, to right about here. I sprinkled the seeds in and just kind of pressed them into the soil. And then I sprinkled a little tiny bit of what's called chicken grit over the top. It's a really fine gravel. And I basically did it just till I couldn't see big spots of soil showing through. But that allows a little bit of light to get to those seeds, which some of them need. So I don't have like a handy rule of thumb for you as far as which seeds need light to germinate. Most of them do not, and most edible crops, it seems like they don't. But just be aware if it says, press into surface of soil, or only lightly cover, or just water in and don't cover, that all means, just sprinkle them on the top and do minimal from there on. And then once they germinate, of course, they're going to need light like everything else. Growing the most in where especially artificial lighting comes into play in a big way is with starting things indoors. Because unless you have a really awesome like south-facing window, or just a window that gets a lot of ambient light. I know some people have these windows that kind of jut out of their house. I forget what that's called, but those are like made for seed starting because they get sun from, instead of just getting sun from one pane that they have to lean towards, they're getting it in more of a surrounding way. But what I've noticed is even with the brightest window I can find, especially like tomatoes and peppers and things, they're still going to get leggy and they're still going to lean like crazy. So if you're going to do them that way, you still can. You just need to, I would turn the thing every day. I would give it a 180-degree turn once every day. So they're at least happening to do a little bit of work. And then the other thing you can do, and just what I've always done, is I didn't grab one from the garden store. We sell these in the garden store, but I really like, they're called T5 fluorescents. And they're a type of fluorescent strip light, so they look just like a fluorescent tube, like a shop light or anything. But the diameter is much skinnier. They're only about this big around, and they're the most efficient fluorescent light you can get. So they're brighter. They put out the correct spectrum for starting plants, which shop lights don't. It's just not like a good plant light. But these T5 fluorescents are cool because they come in 2-foot or 4-foot lengths. And you can get a fixture that just holds one of them. It's called a strip light. And those are perfect. One of those 2-foot strips, you don't even have to build anything. You can just lay it on top of the humidity dome, just lay it, turn it on, and that's it. And then they don't put out enough heat to burn anything. They don't put out any more heat than a heating mat does. When they're on top of it, a lot of it's going up anyways. But yeah, I find that just works so well for so much. And then, once your seedlings are up, they're getting nice bright light.